It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. Coming up on today's show, we have Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg today on a number of things, getting Facebook and WhatsApp to crack down on scammers posing as lawyers trying to fool immigrants in the current mass deportation environment into giving them money. It's part of our cybersecurity series. We'll also talk with DA Bragg about the crime rates in the city right now, what's different for prosecutors with Mayor Mamdani in office now compared to Mayor Adams, and also a wrongful murder conviction that Bragg got overturned 25 years later. The poor guy served so much time. Alvin Bragg coming up. Also, two new notable actions against diversity efforts by the Trump administration. Did you hear they're investigating the Women's College, Smith College, for what Trump may see as sex discrimination for admitting any trans women? And they're suing the New York Times for allegedly discriminating against a white man by trying to increase representation in leadership of underrepresented groups. And we'll have a call-in at the end of the show on when you choose to listen to a book as opposed to read it. That's all coming up, but let's start with this. You were just listening to One Angle about airlines on the BBC. How about this one? Price shocks and shortages are now hitting the airline industry as a result of the Iran war. You know that much. And you've probably heard that Spirit Airlines, the budget carrier, shut down the other day, and it's being blamed on effects from the war. Maybe you yourself have had a Spirit reservation now disappear. Less competition means prices for other flights are going up. Supply and demand, Economics 101. So does the supply and demand shock from the closing of the Strait of Hormuz to most oil shipments affect you now? There's even the prospect of actual fuel shortages in which airlines can't get enough for their whole schedule at any price. We'll talk about this and invite your questions, comments, and personal stories with Wall Street Journal reporter Dean Seal. Among his stories this week, why the collapse of Spirit Airlines means higher fares for everyone. Dean, thanks for joining. Welcome to WNYC.
Hey, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Would you start by reminding everybody of what Spirit Airlines was? Some of our listeners have flown Spirit, many have not. A budget airline, yes, but what did that mean in the context of the industry?
Yeah, so Spirit, it actually traces its roots back to an airline that started in the 1980s, but everyone here probably knows them really well for their ultra low-cost flying. It's something that they started up kind of in the 2000s. It became really, really popular in the 2010s, and it's just, no-frills flying. It's something that we saw Southwest used to do, but Spirit and also Frontier Airlines kind of took it to this new level where, you have to pay a fee for just about everything, including drinks, and it has very tight, leg space, but it gets you from point A to point B pretty much as cheaply as you possibly can in the air.
There was so much derision of Spirit, right? Oh, Spirit stinks because its fares were cheap, but its services were so minimal, not to mention the legroom in the ways that you were just describing. Why did people say that as opposed to understand that, you get what you pay for, and the way they got prices down was to keep amenities down? That was the deal.
Right. Yeah, Spirit certainly drew some negative headlines because, I think there were plenty of kind of viral videos of bad behavior on flights. And, Spirit, with its really low prices, tended to maybe draw in some more chaotic actors here and there. That said, you could see chaos in the skies across almost any airline. But Spirit was definitely, I think they were able to draw a lot of that attention because they are so cheap. They've got those really bright yellow planes. So it was easy for them to come sort of the, punchline and a joke on late night shows. But yeah, I think at the same time, they had a massive consumer base. Like they were extremely popular in the 2010s, and they were actually quite profitable then because, I'll admit, I used to fly Spirit all the time. I still had a flight booked on Spirit at the end of this month. Because like you said, if you're flying for an hour, 2 hours, you don't really need a lot of amenities. You just want to get somewhere, efficiently, on time if you can, and not pay too much money.
You just gave us an angle on another story. Wall Street Journal reporter flew Spirit Airlines a lot. The Wall Street Journal couldn't even spring for business class. All right, maybe we won't do that story. Listeners, did you have a flight booked with Spirit? Were you stranded on Saturday, maybe you had a flight booked for an upcoming summer vacation. How were you caught in the crosshairs of Spirit's closure? Are you a former Spirit employee? Another angle, we can take calls from some of you who are affected in that way. Maybe you have a lament, a eulogy for Spirit Airlines to share. And beyond that, anybody who works in the industry in any way. I just met a listener the other day who told me she's a flight attendant. If you're out there, call us up, or anybody else in the business, to say what's going on beyond the closure of Spirit Airlines. That's kind of the headline, but there's this whole systemic thing as a result of the war that we're talking about in this segment with Dean Seal from the Wall Street Journal. Tell us a story from your perspective as a passenger, as an airline industry worker, anyone else, or ask a question. 212-433 WNYC, 212-433-9692. Call or text. Dean, before we even get to the shutdown of Spirit and what's going on in the industry now with the war, on the impact of Spirit on other airlines, when Spirit existed, there's a concept in the airline industry, I understand, called the Spirit effect. What was it?
That's right. So, when Spirit was really starting to take off, it caused, it's supply and demand, right? And so if there is a lot of demand for these really cheap flights, then, the laws of competition dictate that other carriers are going to have to lower their prices. And that's what we saw on pretty much every big route that Spirit was flying. We saw other carriers starting to bring their prices down to better compete. Now, obviously, they had different offerings because they had slightly, let's say more legroom, or you got a bag of peanuts and a drink on the flight. And so there was still higher flights necessarily than Spirit. But at the same time, it always set this floor, I think, for every other airline that they had to keep up with.
We should say that Spirit had already filed for bankruptcy twice before. First, as I'm seeing it, in November of 2024, then again last August. So was last weekend's collapse a surprise or really a result of the war, or was it just a matter of time?
I think it was a surprise. Now, that doesn't mean that the week before it happened, it was a huge surprise, but we knew back in February that Spirit had come to the bankruptcy court and they said, we have a plan. We have a way of getting out of bankruptcy. It's going to be better than the last time we did it because I talked to the CEO and he said the first bankruptcy didn't really fix any of the problems that Spirit was facing because they didn't get lean enough. But this new plan, they were going to become a smaller airline. They were going to cut their costs. They were going to park some of their newer aircraft that cost more to maintain. And with this, this new lean company could be competitive still. And so that seemed to be going well. I think that there was a little bit of optimism that this plan could work out. But then I believe that hearing was almost exactly a week before the war in Iran started. And so when the war started, we saw jet fuel more than double in the matter of a few weeks. And I think that's when everybody started to say, okay, I don't know if this plan that they had taken so long to work out is really going to be feasible in this new cost environment that we're working with. And that's something that you saw from every airline. Like pretty much every airline entered this year with a lot of optimism about what was going to happen because, as has been borne out, there's a ton of demand for air travel right now, and everyone was hoping to seize on that. That really changes in a higher fuel cost environment. And when we say higher, we don't mean 10% or 20%. If it goes from under $3 a barrel or a gallon to more than $4 a gallon, that's going to change everybody's cost sheets.
Yeah. And just before we go on fully to the war, I mean, just out of my own curiosity, and if I don't know this, probably a lot of the listeners don't know this. Why was Spirit Airlines having trouble in the first place? You were just describing this massively influential bargain airline, budget airline model that they had that affected the whole industry, and presumably people were flocking to Spirit because they could get cheap fares. So why was it going into bankruptcy repeatedly in the first place?
Well, the operating model that they had back in the 2010s obviously made sense. If they were able to seize on demand and keep their own costs low, then they could charge low prices and pick up profits there. But after the pandemic, obviously the cost analysis for everyone changed. So Spirit was still trying to fly those really cheap flights, but at the same time, the cost of labor had gone up to keep up with inflation. That was across every industry, and the airline industry was no different. So labor is it's the biggest cost that airlines face. So they had that going on. They had some supply issues going on as well. Maintenance was costing more. So if all of their costs are going up, but they're not charging all that much more in airfare, it's hard to remain profitable. And so their debt load continued to get higher. They were posting losses. And so that's what ultimately led them to the first bankruptcy that we saw. Whereas some other carriers who were still facing those same cost pressures, they weren't pricing as low. They were still trying to keep up with Spirit on the low end, but they were also charging more for more standard main cabin airfare and their more premium products. So they were able to continue to pull profits in a way that Spirit was not.
All right, so that was the backdrop. And then the war started in February. The U.S. and Israel attacked Iran. You were giving us some of the numbers of how jet fuel prices went up, according to your colleagues in another Wall Street Journal article, that doubled jet fuel prices. It added $10 to $15 million a week in expenses for Spirit. So this was happening with other airlines too. So why is it only Spirit so far that's gone out of business?
Well, Spirit, I think, was just the closest to the brink at the time. I mean, they were in bankruptcy. Even if they had a plan to get out, they were still cutting capacity. They were still pulling down the number of flights that they were flying. They were parking aircraft. So I think they were simply closest to the brink in a lot of ways. That does not mean that every other airline is completely, out of trouble at this point. We've seen that all the other budget carriers that competed with Spirit, so think like Frontier and JetBlue, this is a huge problem for them as well. They have, like Spirit, gone to the federal government and started to request relief. So that's a pretty good sign that, well, maybe not in the same dire straits. There is massive concern amongst the value carriers right now. And they were doing that sort of separately from Spirit because Spirit was looking for something closer to a bailout while the other carriers were looking for just some sort of relief, be that on, taxes or some direct loans. But at the same time, I don't think anyone is out of the woods right now.
Yeah, talk about the bailout deal that some people thought was really in the works, and then obviously it fell apart. I see that Spirit's CEO, Dave Davis, told the Wall Street Journal, we thought we were going to get the liquidity we needed. And I see the deal on the table would have given the federal government a 90% stake in Spirit, a very Trumpian kind of deal, right?
Right.
90% stake in Spirit for the federal government for $500 million, according to the Journal. Why didn't it go through?
Yeah, so I think there was a lot of optimism that a Spirit bailout was going to happen because it seemed like something that Trump really wanted. For a little bit of context here, Trump himself used to own and run an airline. I think it was called Trump Shuttle, and this was back in, I think, from 1988 to the 91 or 92. He wanted his own airline, just like he wants his own stakes or whatever. He wants his hands in a little bit of every business. But that airline ultimately shut down. It only lasted, I think, under 5 years. And when it shut down and it liquidated, it had to get eaten up by the lenders. That's exactly what's happening with Spirit now. So I think that he actually did have some this feeling that, this is my chance to finally save an airline. And he said a few times in the Oval Office, too, that he likes having a lot of airlines because if you have more airlines, you have more competition. That said, Trump may have been the only one who was really into this plan of doing a bailout. We saw a lot of skepticism from other lawmakers and policymakers. Secretary Sean Duffy, the head of the Transportation Department, he didn't seem really all that on board with the idea. I don't think he outright said that because, he needs to follow Trump's directions. But he wasn't really out pitching for it. We knew that other people in the airline industry obviously were not into it because some of the bigger players want to see Spirit out of the industry. And then there was also just other folks in the administration and lawmakers like Senator Ted Cruz who came out fully against this idea because, the idea is that the government doesn't know how to run an airline. And I think that is a fair argument to make.
In fairness to Trump's assertion that this was multifactorial, even from the political side, not just the business side, their position is that the Biden Justice Department killed Spirit by blocking the merger with JetBlue that they were discussing back in 2024. Again, Spirit's own CEO, Dave Davis, to quote him, he told CNBC, I believe that we wouldn't be in the situation we are right now if that merger had gone through. Why was that merger blocked?
So that merger blocked was for sort of the same competitive arguments that folks are making now to try to get a bailout. And the idea is just that if we were to take Spirit out of the market back in when those merger talks were happening, then we would still lose the floor setter, the anchor for pricing within the industry. And so it made more sense for competition to keep Spirit around rather than fold it into another competitor. Now, that was an argument made by the antitrust division of the Justice Department at the time. It was an argument that a federal judge agreed with, and so that's why we have the situation on our hands now. That said, I don't know if it's all that fair to say that there was one pivotal moment where suddenly Spirit was doomed.
Yeah.
There's plenty of sliding door moments that you can look back on, whether it was, when that merger didn't go through, which again was certainly the Biden administration directed that, but they can't do that unilaterally. A federal judge agreed with the arguments, and then you could look at the
it's
war.
such a basic argument in antitrust, right? It's a basic principle of supply and demand. If there's more consolidation in an industry that has fewer players, as mergers take place, then they're going to be able to establish prices without as much competition. That would be the principle under which Biden's Justice Department or anybody might refuse any kind of corporate merger, right?
Exactly. I think it's straightforward enough that you can understand why a federal judge would have agreed it with the government in this case. And we know that even as there was as the antitrust case was getting adjudicated, there was some concerns from JetBlue that maybe they wanted to actually pull out of the deal because they no longer thought it made sense for them. So it's not like this was something that absolutely everybody wanted, and then one person, one department, one administration stepped in and said no. There was a lot of uncertainty around whether this was going to go through in the first place.
So JetBlue must have had a change of mind, because if they were trying to acquire Spirit just a couple of years ago, now Spirit was getting into trouble. They had an opportunity, presumably, to acquire it, maybe cheap, rather than the government taking it over or going out of business. But where were they?
Yeah, Spirit was certainly up for sale. If somebody had stepped in and said that they wanted to buy it, Spirit would have accepted that deal because they wanted to find some way out of bankruptcy. But the reality of the situation is that when they entered bankruptcy back in the fall, they had, I think we saw more than $7.4 billion in debt and lease obligations. That's a lot of debt to take on, particularly if you're a competitor in the low-cost flying industry who might have a lot of debt yourself. So I'm not sure if it made financial or economic sense for someone to swoop in.
Let's get a couple of listener stories on here. This is people who were stranded when Spirit suddenly went out of business on Saturday. Kate in Manhattan, you're on WNYC. Hi, Kate. Thank you for calling in.
Oh, thanks for having me. A huge fan of your show and NPR and WNYC. So yes, I was the probably first batch of passengers who found themselves without a flight. We were scheduled to fly to Miami from LaGuardia on Saturday, a 9:15 a.m. flight. We got to the airport at 7:30, and a security guard, I think, an airport personnel came out to say there are no flights, Spirit is closed. And I had not checked my email, so I was completely at a loss as to what's going on. And my Uber driver said, Spirit has gone out of business. So I was informed by the Uber driver. And so we went to the next terminal and started the process of rebooking. And 2 hours later, I emerged with 2 one-way flights, JetBlue to Fort Lauderdale rather than Miami, at about $100, or maybe a little bit more than 100 per ticket, which was okay. But my return flight was the only thing I could find that would work was an AA flight, American Airlines flight. And it was almost $400, but no choice but to book it at that point. And that evening, Saturday evening, I was looking at the news to see what's going on with Spirit, and I read that airlines like JetBlue, Delta, AA, they're saying they're stepping in to help stranded passengers and also personnel, Spirit personnel. They're going to offer rescue fares. So I immediately called AA to speak to them to see if I could get the rescue fare retroactively applied to me, because I bought the tickets kind of under duress on the morning. And the agent who spoke to me, he was very nice. He said, we've got no information, no update on prices. So there may very well be a rescue fare, but it hasn't trickled down to us. So at this point, also it's a weekend, so we're probably not going to get any information on fares until Monday. So on Monday, I called again, and I checked the fares. It's $200, and I called AA and say, "Can I get this rescue fare? Since if you're helping stranded passengers, I'm one of them." But I was told no. So I wrote an email to AA through customer relations the form, and I got a generic templatized response saying, "Sorry for the inconvenience. We aim to please." That's it. So I would love to know more about this rescue fare.
Probably written by AI, that one. Well,
exactly.
Dean, is this representative of other stories you've heard? Is there any recourse for Kate at this point, especially with some promise, maybe it was a vague promise, that those who got stranded would be helped?
Yeah, Kate, you're certainly not alone, and I'm sorry to hear all this. I know it's been a really complicated and chaotic situation for a lot of flyers. I've talked to more than a dozen since the weekend, and like I said, you're not alone. I do think that I won't give the airlines too much credit. I will say that they have really tried to help people out, but this was a last minute situation for them as well. I don't think anyone expected that, it would be under 24 hours between when the Spirit announced that it was liquidating and when the final flight was going to take off. And so airlines are scrambling. They're trying to figure out ways to help people, but at the same time, it's a messy network of flights. And I would just encourage you to keep up the pressure on AA to get them to honor the rescue fares that they've put out there. Even if your situation doesn't quite fall into that bucket, there's no harm in continuing to say, "Listen, you offered these fares. I was scrambling. I need you to help me out."
Oh, boy. Kate, I hope that's somewhat helpful. Good luck with that. And here's another one. Judy in Queens. You're on WNYC. Hi, Judy.
Hi. Good morning. Yeah, I was similar to that woman, except I was going from Florida to LaGuardia. And I had been visiting a friend in Ocala and had heard on Friday that there was a possibility that something might happen. A girlfriend called me from New York and said, something's going on. She heard it on the news. So I was, checking email and text messages constantly until 2:30. I got a text in the morning saying, and I was supposed to fly out and, get picked up in the morning. And I got the text, we're sorry for the inconvenience, just like the lady before said. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know what to do because there was also a tornado watch in Ocala. And I didn't know if I should even fly out. Maybe, it looked like everything was going against me going home, but I had I had a memorial service on Sunday that I was supposed to go to, so I had to get home on Saturday night. It was just it was very stressful. I didn't know what to do, and I kept going back and forth, should I go, shouldn't I go? And decided finally to go. I went on looking for a flight, any flight to get me home around the same time. Saturday night, I paid $300 to go home. Then I got something from JetBlue that said we're offering, like the woman said, rescue flights for $99. Uh-huh. So, and I had already paid for my flight through JetBlue. So I went on JetBlue, asked them if I could, cancel that flight. It was just a few, 8 hours later. And they said no because they weren't honoring flights from Orlando. They said only 2 places in Florida, so something like that. I don't know. I didn't understand it. And so I just came back. I did have insurance on the flight. I did pay for that, and I also paid for a refundable ticket. I don't think that matters anymore.
Judy, thank you for that story. Ugh. And here's one more in a text that ends in a question for you, Dean. Listener writes, I would like to share my story with you about Spirit Airlines. My ticket was part of a vacation package to Florida. All these Florida stories, right? And somebody's going to make like a horror movie, a satirical horror movie about getting stuck at Disney World. because of Spirit Airlines. But this listener writes, the flight was canceled last moment. I could never make it to Florida. I'm still struggling to get a refund for the hotel, which I couldn't use because of the flight cancellation. So there's some domino effect there, Dean. And listener writes, it's very time-consuming, inconvenient, and stressful. In addition, my daughter has a credit with Spirit Airlines because she had to cancel her ticket, and I don't know what's going to happen with the credit. So what about anybody who might have had a credit outstanding with Spirit Airlines for whatever reason?
Yeah, unfortunately, with this liquidation, Spirit did say that, for anyone who had bought a flight, they would find a way to refund them. I'm not sure if those refunds have gone out. I don't believe that I've been refunded for the ticket that I had that's been canceled. But as far as credits go, it's hard to say. Same thing with sort of the Spirit loyalty points. It's hard to say that anything is going to come of that. It may just be the case that those are now expired as a result of the liquidation.
Listener texts, no mention of let's buy Spirit Airlines. It's all over social media. This guy, Hunter Peterson, is trying to create the people's airline, quote unquote. It's all over social media. Let's buy Spirit Airlines. Have you seen that meme?
Absolutely. I've been to the website. I've talked to a few people who have pledged money towards the website as of right now. I've kept up with some of the videos as well. And hey, I say more power to Hunter. I hope that he keeps it up. Now, I know it's a major lift, and all of the pledges so far are unverified. That's why it's been a little bbit hard for us to follow up on this because there's some eye-popping numbers, but no money has been exchanged yet. That said, I've been really heartened by it as a fan of the Green Bay Packers who. They used a similar kind of tactic to get out of financial trouble. I think that it's awesome that people are coming together like this and shows off how popular Spirit really was.
Did not expect the Green Bay Packers to come up in this conversation.
I find any excuse I can.
We won't talk about the Jets or the Giants. We're going to take a break and come back. And really, if you've been listening since the beginning, folks, we've only been talking about what has happened so far. We'll talk next with Dean Seal from the Wall Street Journal about what might happen next as the war and the surge in fuel prices and fuel shortages continue. Stay with us. Brian Lehrer on WNYC as we continue to talk about airline industry price shocks, potential fuel shortages, or maybe they're real fuel shortages already. I'll ask our guest. Spirit Airlines closing down on Saturday, all as a result of the war in Iran and what might happen next. Our guest is Dean Seal, reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Dean, are there fuel shortages already taking place? Are any airlines unable to get fuel at any price to meet their schedules?
Here in the U.S., it doesn't seem to be the case. We do know that there's fuel shortages disrupting travel in Asia and Europe. So far, it seems like the U.S. airlines are doing okay.
And what can we expect in terms of price? Of course, it's such a, changeable situation. The president is talking about potential deals with Iran, but then there's, closing the Strait of Hormuz, not closing the Strait of Hormuz, escorting ships through the Strait of Hormuz, then not. So I know this could all change 5 minutes after you give us whatever answer, but what is, the best wisdom saying about what travelers and employees, for that matter, can expect as the summer travel season approaches?
Yeah, I think, we should probably have an expectation that jet fuel is going to remain elevated. Now, even as I say that, I know that yesterday the price of jet fuel per gallon did finally slip back below $4 for the first time since March. So who knows? Like I said, by the end of this sentence, it's possible that maybe the Strait of Hormuz will be completely open and everything will start to normalize. But that's not how the airlines are seeing it. They know that the situation is dynamic, but they are certainly planning for the second quarter to be a quarter in which they're constantly paying much higher prices for fuel than they had anticipated when they started making their projections at the beginning of the year. So with that said, fares are going to go up. And that's both because of the jet fuel crisis. That's because of Spirit leaving the market. So anyone who hasn't booked their travel, I'd say to probably do it as soon as you can. Because even if we do see jet fuel start to come back down, that doesn't necessarily mean that fares are going to start to come down in tandem.
But wait, let's say you have a vacation plan for August and there's a deal struck with Iran next week, wouldn't fares for the August flight be lower if you wait a little bit than if you book them today?
So I'd love to say yes, but in my research for all of this, for the story that we put out earlier this week, I found a paper that was published in 2022 from some business professors who looked at airfares and jet fuel fluctuations between 2001 and 2016. And the trend that they observed was something they called rockets and feathers. So essentially, anytime jet fuel went up by $1, the average price of airfare went up by about 42 cents. When the price of jet fuel then went down by $1, the statistical change in airfares was negligible. So essentially, if you see oil prices go up, then you will see fares rocket up. When you see jet fuel prices go down, they tend to float down like feathers. You might see a little bit of the price for domestic fares go down. They generally stay about flat. In a lot of these cases, the price of more premium seats like first class actually go up even when jet fuel prices come down. And the reality of the situation is businesses are not want to bring down their fares, to bring down their prices. If they can raise prices and get away with it, meaning if they can raise prices and demand holds steady, which is what we've seen so far through the first quarter, there's almost no incentive for them to bring down their fares. Even if demand does start to take a little bit of a hit, then for airlines, they can actually just start to fly less. They just pull some of their flights out of the pool and they can keep their prices pretty much steady.
A lot of people would call that price gouging, because if their costs come down, but they don't pass that along to customers, then they're making more profit on the same thing, seats on an airline, in this case, on an airplane, than they were before the spike, and that's price gouging. Is there any other term for it?
I would not argue against somebody using that language. I don't know if I'd use it myself just because I don't know if there's any repercussions for me using something like that. But, airlines, listen, I'll say that executives have been saying for a while now that the price of almost everything after the pandemic went up much higher than the price of airfare did. So they're saying essentially that, this has been overdue that some of their fares would go up. Now, of course, the reason for that was during the pandemic. Other industries were able to raise prices because there was still demand for it, whereas airlines, they were seeing a decline in air travel demand necessarily in 2020 and 2021. So they've been playing catch up for a little bit. So they would say that this is a normalization of the price, or at least normalizing it in tandem with where CPI has been over the last few years.
So in that context, why did it take the war to have them jack up prices? If they can sell the same number of seats for $200 as they can sell for $100, why weren't they doing that already?
Well, I will say that we saw before the war even broke out, so in the months of January and February, airfare prices were actually going up during that time. This was just an acceleration event when the war happened. And I think it's, if we're being honest, I think it's because if executives can point to a headline and say, this is the reason we're raising prices, they're going to take advantage of that situation. And so that's what they've been doing so far. Now, at the same time, they do have to also show shareholders, because these are all publicly traded companies, that they are actively doing something about the new cost situation that they found themselves in. So, if they can say, listen, we have these higher costs, we're raising prices, demand is holding steady, then their stocks won't suddenly start to plunge because, they've shown that they've taken action.
Does the law have anything to say? I assume not, about not bringing down prices when your costs go down? Any kind of windfall profits tax or caps? We've had that once or twice in the history of the United States. Do you know if there's talk in Congress about applying anything like that to this situation for once the war is over and fuel prices start to come down, or anything like that?
As far as I know, there's been no chatter among lawmakers to try to scrutinize what airlines are doing through all of this. There's a lot more chatter about, do we try to find some sort of help for the low cost carriers who might struggle to survive all of this? But no, as of right now, it seems like the airlines are able to continue to raise prices, and it's not really batting an eye for anyone. If there was more of a public outcry around this, then sure, I'm sure there'd be some more scrutiny. But from what we've seen so far, demand is held steady, meaning that consumers are just continuing to eat these prices even as they go up.
Oh, yeah, you mentioned other budget airlines, and I did see your article in late April about talks for relief for budget airlines, plural, not just Spirit. Now Spirit has gone under. I also saw, I think this was your article in the last day, Frontier Airlines, another budget airline, their stock went up, maybe not surprisingly, after Spirit went under. But do you think there are other budget airlines that are at risk of being the next Spirit?
So this is an interesting situation because on the one hand, by Spirit going under, that, it should actually benefit all the other budget carriers, right? If one of their main competitors and someone who did keep their prices down is out of the market, they're going to pick up some of those customers, the Spirit customers who still need to find ways to travel. Though ostensibly they're going to grab more customers. It gives them the ability to raise prices. Now, that said, that could help in the short term, but there's still some long-term problems with the low-cost business model. Because the cost environment is still very high. There's still a lot of debt for some of these low-end carriers. And we've already seen some pivots among those carriers to start looking a little bit more like the big guys. JetBlue, Frontier, I mean, we saw it with Southwest already. They're changing their business models away from the no-frills flying and trying to find new ways to implement premium products to help bolster their revenue.
And what about the employees? The stat I have is that about 14,000 Spirit employees are now out of work. That's pilots, that's flight attendants, that's mechanics, that's gate agents. How much are other airlines going to absorb them, or what happens to them other than, like anybody else who gets laid off, they go on unemployment and look for work, but that's 14,000 people all of a sudden.
Yeah, I think that's one of the toughest outcomes of all of this. So now I've seen a lot of numbers being floated around. I've heard 14,000, I've heard 17,000. But if we actually look at some of the bankrupt filings that Spirit had, they were supposed to give the bankruptcy court kind of monthly update reports on how much cash they had on hand, how many employees they had on hand. And as of the end of February, they reported only having about 7,000 employees. Now, the bigger numbers that you've seen, those probably include furloughed employees because Spirit was having to furlough some pilots and flight attendants as it was cutting out the amount of flying that it was doing. That said, 7,000 employees, that's still a lot of people. And we know that the flight attendants union was really pushing really hard for some kind of deal to save the airline. Now, on the one hand, we probably will see other airlines, since they're going to, start to fly more of the routes that Spirit has exited to help those customers out. They probably will absorb some employees, but it's hard to say that this is going to be a one-to-one situation where every person who has had to leave Spirit is going to be able to find a job. And I'd say that it's going to hit different people differently because I think a lot about maybe the senior pilots at Spirit. It's going to be really hard for them to then go get a job at another airline where they're low on the seniority list. If they were close to retiring, that could be a tough way to start anew if they were hoping to, retire out in the next 5 to 10 years.
We have 1 minute left in the segment. Here's one more listener question. Listener writes, are we taking a risk flying to Europe early this summer that we may get stuck there because the airlines will run out of jet fuel? Can you answer that listener's question?
I don't think that that's necessarily a major risk, but that said, it's certainly something to keep in mind. I think anybody who's booking travel overseas right now should pay attention not only to the way that prices are exploding over there, but the uncertainty that those airlines have. So everyone needs to stay frosty right now.
Well, this is obviously a big reason that Trump is pushing for some kind of a deal because the public, according to the polls, is increasingly blaming him for things just like this. So we will see what happens with that, and we will see what happens, deal or no deal, with airline shortages, airline prices, airline employment. Dean Seal, corporate news reporter at the Wall Street Journal, thank you so much for all the information.
Brian, it's been a pleasure.
WNYC's journalism and storytelling is heard by millions of passionate listeners. Sponsors of our programming gain our listeners' attention and their respect. Learn about how your organization can support WNYC and WNYC Studios at sponsorship.wnyc.org.